The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Bigger Picture, Analyzing Aerial Imagery. Yes, my name is Dan Davidson. I'm an agronomist and technical advisor to the Illinois Soybean Association. And on behalf of the Illinois Soybean Association and IntelinAir, who's presenting today, we want to welcome you to today's webinar. And thank you for taking some time out of your day to attend. This imagery, I've been kind of involved in it back to 1995 when I first got sort of involved a little bit in it, when people were getting landscape images and trying to use them to look at crops and make some decisions. So here we are, nearly 25 years later, and this imagery has been around a long time, and we'll hear from Greg Rose about some of that history today. Our presenters are Greg Rose, co-founder and Vice President of Product Development at IntelinAir. He is responsible for product management and go-to-market strategies for the company's remote sensing solutions for precision agriculture. The co-presenter today is Ivan or Alex Dozier, an agronomist with IntelinAir. Alex is a native of Southern Illinois and has farming in his background and is an agronomist. He is responsible for aerial image analysis and agronomic field scouting, comparing what you see from the air with the agricultural issues occurring on the ground. We want to welcome both presenters today. A little bit on logistics. You'll see on your dashboard to your right, you can post any questions today. We'll answer those questions at the end of the day, at the end of the webinar here at after about 15 minutes. If you're a CCA and you signed up and you put in your CCA number, you'll get 1 credit in crop management today. If you listen to the recorded version of this webinar, you can go online into your CCA account and self-apply for that 1 credit. So again, thank you for attending today's webinar. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Greg to start his presentation. So Greg, you can take it from here.
That sounds great, Dan. Thanks so much. And just want to say that, we appreciate the opportunity to speak to everybody and talk about aerial imagery and remote sensing. So there's 2 of us, as Dan said, on the line. I thought, Dan, you did a great job introducing us. So, I'll kind of move forward with the presentation here. Really, there's 3 parts to what we're going to cover today. First part is measure, the idea of using remote sensing, using imagery to measure crop performance. And, as someone with a background in analytics, I think that is, in general, a big problem in agriculture today is just the lack of measurability, especially with respect to crop performance. Typically, you have to rely on the yield maps, which can have precision and accuracy issues and come at the end of the year. And so really the idea here is to bring that measurement, bring that visibility forward in the year. And so the first part of the presentation, we're going to talk a bit about this. We're going to give some context. We get a little technical just so that everybody understands what is going on in terms of measuring using imagery and cameras from above. Then the second step is to actually analyze that imagery. The image itself, often without some either expert or some review of it or an analytic system to look at it, it can be difficult to get to the final stage, which is action. So we'll talk a little bit about analyzing, and then we're also going to show several examples that Ivan will go through of actually acting, making decisions, and getting insights from imagery and analysis of your farm. So, this is kind of a, high school science experiment that, I'm sure virtually everybody on the webinar will remember, where they shine the flashlight into the prism, and it breaks up into different bands of light. And you know, that's really what we're doing with remote sensing. We're basically using this fact to really analyze different bands of light and understand different signatures to look at that relate to plant health and crop stress. Now, what you see here, obviously, is the visible light. What this chart shows is the entire spectrum, and you'll notice the visible light is kind of that relatively narrow part in the middle there. You know, that's what we see with the human eye. You know, your iPhone camera, for example, is going to take pictures in that range. For agriculture, you'll often hear the term multispectral or near infrared. And the idea there is just to the right of red, just outside of visible range, is what you have, what they call the near infrared spectrum, near in the sense that it's close to red. And then as you get further to the right, you get to longer and longer wavelengths. And when you get out to long wave infrared, you have what are called thermal cameras, which are also you know, not as common as multispectral cameras, but they're increasingly being used specifically to measure radiation or heat. And so basically the idea here is to measure different bandwidths, different values using different types of cameras, and then correlate those to crop performance or problems in the field. So what are some examples of these? This is, obviously the simplest example, RGB, red, green, blue. This is simply just a normal visual image that all of us are used to, and that all of us could take with any camera that we have, the iPhone camera or whatnot. It's a great image because it shows you an image that any human being can relate to. Because it's what you'd see with the naked eye if you were in a plane flying over the field. And so, it tends to be a very common image that farmers use to diagnose problems that agronomists look at. It's also useful for crop scouts because, again, it's something that people are used to seeing with their normal day-to-day life. Probably the next most common image in agriculture is what they call an NDVI image, which stands for Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. And you can see the formula for it there, but basically what it's measuring is the difference between near infrared and red, and then it's mapping that to an index. And the idea here is that when light hits a plant, it behaves, different bands of light behave differently. So the visible light, a lot of it will be absorbed by the plant. That's, for example, why plants look green. The near infrared, on the other hand, is typically just going to reflect off. It's not going to be absorbed. And so by measuring that difference, you're able to get a proxy for biomass and stress in the field. And so if you imagine a fully healthy corn plant that's dark green and tall with wide leaves, and you compare that to one that is yellowed and let's say sickly, you're going to end up with a different NDVI value. There's different color scales that are applied to NDVI. The image that you see here shows probably the most common one. Dark green is going to correlate to the healthier, less stress areas, whereas yellow and red would correlate to the high stress areas. And typically a parking lot, for example, or a road would be bright red. NDVI, it's very useful, especially once the crop canopy closes, as it can be impacted by soil. It's one of many different vegetation indexes. It's certainly the most common. It actually dates back, even to the late 1970s, 1980s with research that NASA did. And it's one that you'll encounter quite frequently. The next example here is a color infrared image. If you think of RGB as red, green, blue, a color infrared is typically near infrared, red, and green. What's going to happen is the plants will actually show up as red. You will see a correlation with the NDVI image. So in the color infrared image, your darker red areas are going to tend to be the healthier areas, higher biomass, less stress. Your lighter red or even like purplish areas would tend to be, areas that, are higher stress. Color infrared is very useful, especially early in the season. Different crop patterns tend to show up very well in it. I will say that it is possible to generate this image with different color scales. And so sometimes you won't see it red like this, but this is often a common way to view it. This is an example of a thermal image. So a thermal camera, as we saw from the earlier slide, it's measuring a different part of the spectral bandwidth. And really what it's measuring is the radiation coming off the field. It's typically going to be lower resolution, so it's not going to give as sharp of an image as the image cameras that I showed in the last few slides. Again, it's going to be presented with some sort of color index. Typically, it's going to be red is hot, blue is cold. And basically the interesting thing to look for here is variance in temperature across the field. If you had a perfectly uniform field that was similar in all ways, you would expect the image to be uniform, or to have uniform temperature. So if you see a temperature that has difference, the question is why. Often it's due to water, and that's going to be probably the most common reason you'll see differences in temperature. It can also be due to climate effects. LIDAR is actually a different type of image, and I include it here because we've had some questions on it in the past. A LIDAR is actually an active sensor, so instead of relying on the sun, it's actually sending light into the field, and it's primarily used to measure topography. And actually, you can get LIDAR data for free from the government. So that's kind of a summary of some of the different types of images that you'll see. I mean, there's frankly others, a number of others available. How do you measure these things? And certainly the most common, and Dan mentioned it earlier in the call, is satellites. They're typically the lowest cost. They're ubiquitous. I mean, most of the agricultural solutions that you potentially subscribe to typically are going to include satellites. More and more satellite systems are going up, which is significant simply because one of the Achilles heels of a satellite is clouds block it. And so the more satellites you have, the more probability that you're going to be able to get an image without getting the cloud cover blocked. You do have lower resolution, and you can't measure everything that I showed, specifically thermal imagery. You can't measure from satellites. And typically, I think the challenge is actionability with a satellite because it's lower resolution. It's not necessarily good to catch early season issues that are going to happen in May and June. And you tend to see uses more when the canopy closes, use for management zones, kind of general field health, as opposed to pinpointing specific issues. Drones, are getting, of course, more and more common these days. I mean, this image shows, probably the most common drone of them all, the DJI Phantom. Prices have come significantly down. They're getting easier to use. There still can be some, challenges there, but they are getting easier to use. Certainly for visual crop scouting, with, for example, this Phantom, they're pretty easy to use and just see a live view on your smartphone. Really, you can get extremely high resolution because you can, obviously fly the drone if you wanted literally right above the corn or soybean plant. You can fly them anytime you want. But there are significant cons. I mean, somebody does have to fly. The FAA has a prohibition on line of sight flight. There are battery limitations. There are licenses required. And if you want to use these to do analysis, they can, be tricky. And then the, third primary option is actually manned planes. The big benefit with the plane is it can just cover so many acres. It can carry more sensors than a small drone. And you're seeing more and more solutions out there, new business models, where subscription offerings are available to the farmer. You are typically on a schedule, unlike a drone where you can fly it anytime you want. And you're typically, most plane solutions are in the 10 to 50 centimeter per pixel range. And then, there certainly are going to be areas where there's no plane available. In the case of IntelinAir, we use all three of these: satellites, drones, and manned planes, although the manned aircraft is our primary data collection vehicle just because of the scalability that it offers. So, what does this mean? I mean, one of the challenges is you just get all these images, that you have to look through. And one of the challenges with farming is that, during the busiest time of the season, when you have the least time, that's also the time when you can make the most difference with decisions. And so a lot of times, if you just stop with the image, you just might not have time to get through all these images. It can just be overwhelming. And that's where, an analytics solution can come in. And there's increasingly more and more of these being offered in the marketplace today. A big benefit is to allow for sorting, prioritizing, ranking. When you have all these images, the ability to focus on, let's say, the top 5 or the top few to look at, where you think there's where the probability of having problems is highest. That's a huge value of what can be brought with an automated system to analyze imagery. That enables basically management by exception for the farmer. And it really allows you to be more proactive. And so how is that done? And there's a new class of computer vision, machine learning algorithms. There's been a lot of development. I mentioned a few slides ago in the world of sensors, where they're getting increasingly better. There's also, in parallel with that, has been a lot of development on the computer vision and machine learning side. And so the ability for computers, for algorithms to look through these images, look for patterns, look for anomalies, look for problems, look for signatures, and then generate alerts and push those to you so you can react rapidly is a big benefit of this approach. And then you combine that with the high resolution, due to the better sensors, and you get much more, pinpoint scouting and pinpoint identification of problems. In this case, you see a satellite image, you see an image at 10 centimeters per pixel, and you'll notice a couple things. There's some issues on the high resolution image, for example, this planter error that don't even show up on the satellite image. The other issue is just that a lot of these anomalies that have been identified here are due to low elevation. And you can see a couple of those have been picked up here in the satellite image, but it's really not clear, what it is. And so I think you'll find much more informed scouting and much more rapid identification of problems when you just have a higher resolution image to look at. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Ivan, who's going to take you guys through some of the action examples.
All right, well, thank you, Greg. And so as Greg said earlier, it's very important when we're looking at imagery to understand the collection methods, not only the actual vehicles that are used to collect this imagery, which has a very important bearing on the quality of the images that are produced and the scalability which are allowed, but also the different lenses that we're going to look in that are going to tell us different types of issues. It's also helpful to do this in a quick manner that's providing an effort at time, and that's kind of where the automation comes in. And so one other factor that we kind of have to go over here is the timeline. We're going to have different issues that emerge at different parts of the season. And so that's kind of what I'm going to talk about, is just show a few different examples that we have here. Oh man, Greg, what is this? A corn slide for the Illinois Soybean Association? But that's all right. We've got both. We've got examples from both crops that we're going to show. These are from the past two seasons in 2016 and 2017. But the whole point is throughout the growing season, there's going to be different issues that we're going to be looking for. And so depending on when we have flights, we're going to be looking for different things to capture in the imagery. As far as spacing out that timing goes, that's going to depend on your collection method, as Greg talked about a little bit earlier. And then some people are always going to want more flights. Some people are going to want weekly flights. Some people are going to want daily flights. Some people would even like flights several times in the daytime, and then maybe even a few flights during the night. And so it all depends on the time of day and the time of year to be able to talk about what sort of issues that you're going to find. And so you can see the corn timeline here, going all the way from emergence all the way up into harvest. There's a number of different issues, and you can go ahead and go to the next slide there, Greg, for the soybean issues as well. Very similar situation, all the way from emergence, where we're looking at issues such as replant, even soil issues, then herbicide and insecticide, and then even later into the season, looking at some of those issues as we go into harvest. And so these are all issues that we have the capability to capture using some form of aerial imagery, but depending on the resolution, that's going to factor in how we run our diagnosis. Depending on the time of year that we fly, depending on the lenses that we're looking through, that's going to determine how we run through and how we try to identify different issues. And depending on the analytics, that's going to help us sort by those different issues and get a better understanding of where to start and how to organize the operation by using aerial imagery. So we'll start out with early season. And one of the things that really impressed me from looking at a lot of aerial image data this past year is we're able to get insights into the field before the crop even comes up. And so even now, putting airplanes, drones, and satellites up could provide some value for farmers who are trying to figure out when we finally are ready to plant. And I know a lot of people listening in on the webinar across the country are kind of itching probably to get out in the field. We've had some rough weather in the past. But hopefully if the wind and the sun keeps up, the fields will dry out pretty quickly, and we'll have some guys out in the field. But especially for some larger operations, answering that question of Where do you even go? Where do you start? What fields are ready to have equipment go out there? Where are we going to have some issues with threats of compaction? We're going to have to worry about wet spots and saturated soil causing replant zones. And that's one of the advantages of this bare soil thermal map. That's going to give us an idea of what areas of the field are dried out and ready to manage, and what areas of the field are just a little bit too wet that maybe we can hold off a little bit and give those some extra time to dry out. If we go to the next slide here, and you can kind of see this on the thermal image as well, but you can see tile lines. This would be an excellent time of the year to go over and fly some fields and look at the tile patterns that emerge there. That's something that's really helpful. This image here on the left, you can not only see what the tile line looks like just from the bare soil imagery there in early May, but that image there at the bottom is actually an NDVI image from mid-July. And so not only can you see the bare tile lines just from the soil, but you can also see how those tile lines have an effect on the crop once we have our emergence. Over in the image on the right, this is another interesting one where we're looking at our tile lines, but one of the things that we've noticed is under the blue area, we see the tile line throughout the entire field. It seems to be working pretty well. Maybe there's a wet spot in the middle of the field that's a particularly extreme issue with the topography. But there under the green line, we actually see a tile line that doesn't quite go down all the way through compared to its neighboring tile lines. And so that's something where you might have an issue if your tile line is plugged up or broken, and you might need to go out there and evaluate, is it actually working? Then we have the areas under the yellow boxes where there is no tile line at all. And you're able to look at the replant and you see the area where we have completely saturated soil. If that's going to be an area that needs replanted year after year, a map like this could really help justify going in there and installing tile in that section of the field. So I mentioned replant earlier. And as we're looking at the drainage profile, that's obviously a huge action. It's going to occur into both corn and soybean when you have saturated soil, when you have a very wet spring like we've had this year, and especially like we had last year where some of the crop was actually in the ground before the rain started. You're going to have some issues with replant. So here we have the planter map from a farmer last year, field planting in soybean. And we take a look at an early RGB image that shows quite a few wet spots throughout the field. We can see some standing water there on the upper left-hand side and also over on the right side where we've got kind of that white shimmering look. But you even see some wet spots throughout the field where it might not be standing water, but you can even tell that that soil is completely saturated by the pattern of the residue and by the color of the black soil. If we go ahead and transition then to the next image, what we'll see is a vegetative emergence score. So this is actually going to be tracking where different crops are emerging throughout the field. And as you can see, it's working around. It's almost like puzzle pieces around those different areas of saturated soil and standing water alike, showing us areas where the crop didn't emerge. And if we skip ahead to the replant map, what we'll see is those are very similar images. And so you can almost use that early season imagery, that vegetative emergence score, to guide those replant decisions and actually use that map, have it with you in the cab so you know exactly where you need to go to make these replants. Another thing we can use that emergence score for is even if we're not dealing directly with saturated soil and wet spots, sometimes areas in the field like that can have lasting effects. And so one of the things you'll notice here is we've got a little bit of it's like a bathtub mark. You know, we have this area of clumped residues all around where this wet spot used to be far early in the season. This was actually a plugged up drain that caused this. But you see the image on the right, and the crop's going to have a difficult time punching up through that crusted residue. And we're able to see that by looking at that early season imagery. One of the other things that's valuable about collecting high resolution imagery early on for emergence is it can give you an estimation of the stand. One of the things that's always bothered me about relying so heavily on yield data is that it's not necessarily very precise. Our yield maps are generated depending on the width of the harvester, and so it kind of groups rows together into somewhat of an average. But sometimes issues don't occur in the field across that broad spectrum. They're occurring on a row by row basis. What you see here when we're highlighting the individual row, we're actually capturing a couple different issues. You can see we have kind of a repeating yellow line on that image on the right, and you can see it a little bit on the infrared image on the left as well. That's actually a downforce issue from the planter that's causing every so often a row is getting planted shallow. You'll also see kind of these diagonal marks running through the field that are indicative of compaction from getting out there and tilling this field when it was too wet. And so there's some issues like that you might never see on a yield map because all these rows are just going to get bundled together. But when you go back and you view this early season emergence imagery, those issues come to light, and you can not only check with your equipment, to make sure that you don't have issues like that again, but it also gives you a good historical perspective of having a better understanding of what was going on in your field. One of the other really big things that we can capture early on is we're not just looking at soil and emergence issues, but we're also looking at weed detection. One of the things that's helpful to know is that if you're flying your field this time of year, most of the vegetation that you're picking up, if you're looking at like an NDVI image, that vegetation is going to be weed pressure. And so as Greg mentioned earlier with the sorting features, any fields that you're getting that are coming back as high vegetation fields, those are going to be the ones that you want to spray first. And so it's always helpful to be able to check out those images and kind of have that understanding of what you're looking at and having that anchor of the time in the season. Whereas in the middle of the season, a high NDVI score might be a good thing because it means you have a very high performing crop. Early on in the season, this time of year, a high NDVI score for your field might be a bad thing because it could be indicative of this type of weed pressure. And this is going to be really important too as you go out there and you manage that weed pressure to kind of check into how well was that management practice implemented? Did I get the desired results? This is a before and after picture in infrared of spraying that field. And so you can see significantly reduced the number of weeds in that field. However, significantly reduced is not complete elimination. You can see that there were still a couple missed spots that were there in the corner, as well as some individual weeds that were up there on the bottom right-hand side. And so if we take a look at the next image, as we look at those individual weeds, not only can we help guide sprayer decisions by understanding where our weed pressure is, but after those sprays have gone, we can kind of make that determination of if we're still seeing weeds out there. This gives us that capability to spot potential resistant weeds that we can go out there and manage through other means. And so that's one of the things too that's important to keep in mind as we start to tackle larger agronomic issues like the development of resistant traits. This is something where aerial imagery really has a capacity to tackle those problems with greater effectiveness as we move forward to higher resolution and understanding what we're looking at through different time periods throughout the season. And this is just one more example talking about resistant weeds. This is an area where we did confirm resistant weeds. However, we were able to make that determination quicker by using the algorithms that Greg was talking about earlier. And so this gives us an example of after this weed patch has been sprayed, we're able to check with the algorithms and say, all right, is that weed patch actively growing or is it receding? Basically, did the spray take effect? So we don't have to wait a couple weeks to see if those weeds are actually going to show symptoms of curling up and dying off in the field. We're actually able to check in with the algorithms and get immediate insights as to the status of that weed patch, make the determination that it was actively growing, and have that quicker diagnosis that we were indeed dealing with resistant weeds, and we need to go out there and manage that through a means other than spray. So that's kind of what we're looking at early on in the season. So as you can see, before the crops are even up, we kind of have, there's massive potential for aerial imagery and how it can implement itself onto the farm. As we move towards the middle of the season, so we're looking less at the non-crop issues, and now especially looking at NDVI lenses, a lot of these insights are going to be driven more towards the crop health, the overall health of the field. This gives an example of how we kind of imagine actionability being based around the reports that we get from aerial imagery. One of the things you see on the image all the way to the left is that you have kind of this striped pattern throughout the field. which we were able to determine was a nitrogen deficiency that was due to an equipment error. The farmer was able to make some additional fertilizer application, and you can see those blue areas are indicative of improving conditions throughout the field. Once we get all the way over to that image on the right-hand side, we're able to see that that application worked, and there are no more anomalies in that field due to that nitrogen issue. And that's a huge return on investment for that farmer. That's almost a $4,000 saving application in nitrogen. One of the things that really helped us in that image was the ability to recognize those patterns, to see that those vertical lines were indicative of some sort of equipment error. So that's kind of the importance as we start to look at data-driven imagery in understanding different patterns throughout the field. You can use this from a scouting perspective. When I look here at this image on the right, I see a lot of small anomalies that I'm going to kind of ignore. I see my turn rows in the top and bottom of the field. It's not necessarily going to be an actionable insight. I do see a bunch of anomalies clustered together, kind of running a diagonal line through the middle of the field. I'm fairly confident that's a waterway just from understanding the topography of the field. So as I start to look at these different areas that the computer has identified, I'm asking myself, do I have an explanation outright for that issue? And is there something I can do about that, knowing that explanation? And so a lot of those are soil issues that I probably already have an understanding of from looking at some of those earlier images that we were talking about. By looking at this one specifically, we have this cluster of anomalies here that I don't necessarily have an explanation for. And so we're able to go out, scout that location, and find a micronutrient deficiency. Speaking of patterns, this is something that's really helpful for getting early insights into the field. And so you can see here when you have like clusters near the field edges or near a waterway, generally if we're looking at compaction or turn rows, those are all going to be one big anomaly. It's going to be a related issue. But if we have a bunch of little spots, that's often indicative of some sort of early onset pest infestation. So those are other areas that are able to go out and scout. In this instance, we found Japanese beetles in those field edges, but luckily we were able to go out just a little bit further, and as we went out into the field we still found beetle pressure, but as you can see it didn't affect the surrounding field, and so we were able to capture that beetles had entered that field, but we were able to catch them early enough before they caused damage to the majority of the field, and so it was able to kind of capture that early insight and get that alert. Same kind of insight for disease by looking at how the field is changing versus by looking at the fields that we know are poor areas. We're able to get that insight from the change and say it might not be bad enough to trigger a lower NDVI when compared with the rest of the field, but by recognizing that it has gotten a little bit worse as compared to the last image, this is something that we can pick out an early onset of the disease before it really starts dragging down the potential yield of that crop. And so that's something that's really important to keep in mind too as we start to talk about timing. It's not just a snapshot in time, it's also having the ability to compare these images to previous images that you may have generated so you can monitor how the field is progressing. And that is able to give us insights like this. What we're looking at here in the image on the left is we have some anomalies that are showing us an area of poor NDVI and some areas that are showing us improving. The red is poor and the blue is improving. But this is one little replant area. This is almost, it's a little oval that was all planted at the same time. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, if this was planted at the same time and in the same variety, why are some areas getting worse and why are some areas getting better? And so this is a great opportunity to go out there and scout and answer that question. And what we found is all the Japanese beetles that were scattered throughout the field were kind of congregating at a single point in the field with that replant area, that as the rest of the field reached maturity and had moved beyond that, and then the replant was kind of catching up, some of the areas under the blue in the replant were catching up and were pollinating. But then as the Japanese beetles converged on that area, we were able to pick up on the signs of their feeding. This is also helpful when we talk about recognizing patterns and the ability to use these anomalies to quantify, because we're able to recognize a lot of issues that farmers might not have an understanding for how much of an impact that it has on the field. And so we have this area of compaction that was actually up at one of the research plots that we're working with at Iowa State University. And so research plots have, a lot of times they have a little more equipment that runs out on the field. They have a number of applications, and you can kind of see all of the crisscross tire tracks that have been made in this field. So just by able to quantify these areas and not only determine where the compacted areas are, but how many acres were affected, and then at the end of the season, looking at the yield difference and say, there's no difference in these areas of the field other than that one had a number of equipment run over the top of it and was judged to be compacted, and then the rows right next to it were control areas, and we have a huge difference in the yield from that field. And so we're able to go back and take a look at some issues that we might not have thought had as much of an impact as they really do. And we can use aerial imagery to kind of quantify and judge how much of an impact are these different types of issues really having in any given field. Finally, as we start to take a look at special operations, it's not just research that has a lot of equipment going out on top of the field. We also have a lot of experience with center pivots, even here in Illinois, along the Mississippi and Illinois rivers. And so the way I look at it is every time that irrigator makes a pass, that's a potential to evaluate that pass. That's a management practice. Every time you bring equipment into the field, every time that you make a conscious decision that you're going to give some sort of input into your field, whether that's a spray, whether that's a fertilization, a fertilizer application, whether that's an irrigator, you have the potential to go back and say, did it work? Is it working with the efficiency that I hoped? Is it having the impact on this field that I hoped it would? How valuable was this management practice in reality? And so you're able to look at those at the field before and after those management practices and make those comparisons to see how are the different management practices that I'm implementing really having an impact on this field. And so I think that's something very important to keep in mind as you're considering aerial imagery. So finally, we'll get into some late season examples. This is something that we might not be looking at individual fields for action, but this is where we start to look at the bigger picture, so to speak. And we might not actually be going out into the field to make some management decisions, but this is where we'll start to make almost decisions across an entire operation. And those decisions can very much still be guided by aerial imagery on into as we start to think about harvest. So one of the things that we're able to do is a lot of farmers like to go out in late July, early August and do some yield estimates. But other than eyeballing different areas of the field, it's somewhat random to pick what areas of the field that you're going to choose your yield estimate from and whether or not that's average. So one of the things that's helpful for using aerial imagery is it can kind of help guide that decision-making process. You can locate the different areas of the field, not only determine what is average, but also determine what's greater and lower than average to help kind of guide that yield estimation process. Yield estimation is something that, especially as we're really struggling with the markets right now, we can kind of play that to our advantage. And if we can get yield insights earlier in the season, then this is something that can really help us guide whenever we're making decisions about selling the grain and planning what the margins are going to be for the operation. And so it's really something that as we start to make decisions in the middle part of the season, where we can really get a better insight for how the season's going to close and have a better understanding of where the operation's going to be from an economics perspective. One of the other things that we can look through is just because we might not be managing the crop anymore, it's still helpful to have those understandings. Kind of what I mentioned earlier is having the ability for different management practices and seeing how they work or what doesn't work as expected. The same can be done for things such as different hybrids. So you can have different hybrids or different varieties in the field, and you can monitor how those are working, how those are changing all throughout the season. So we take a look at what that looks like when we overlay analytics, you can see the planter map there at the right, and obviously this is somewhat atypical for most farmers in the area, but you can take a look at the image there on the left and you can get insights as to how these hybrids progress throughout the season. So one, that helps you give more information than just a yield map, because you can go back and see throughout the season how are these hybrids progressing. But then also, if your hybrid doesn't yield as well as expected, if you have a particular variety that you were really expected that was going to have a very high yield, then you can go back in the season and you can maybe answer some of those questions as to why it did or didn't perform the way you thought it would. You can also take a look at issues such as lodging or Greensnap. That's something that's really helpful. As significant weather issues continue to impact even later in the season, you can help not only to alert yourself to those issues, but also, as we were talking about earlier, understanding that quantification. Not only knowing that you have issues like lodging out there in the field, but also how much of the field does this issue take up, and to give you a more concrete example of how severe that issue might be. One other thing that I think is really impressive, and this is where we kind of reintroduce the power of that thermal imagery, is as the crops start to dry out, and we're starting to think about where we want to go for harvest, we're able to get some insights onto crop maturity based off of these thermal images. And so as the crops that are still actively growing, they're going to be holding on to that moisture. They're going to register under a lot cooler temperatures than do the crops that are completely dried out and ready to harvest. And so if you think about not only viewing a field in terms of this type of image, where you can see we have one variety here at the top of the field that's clearly not ready to go, but the rest of the field looks pretty ready for harvest. But as you start to collect data on this, and you can imagine that if you were able to sort your field into an average thermal value and then sort by that thermal value, just like we talked about at the very beginning of the season, where you're trying to figure out which fields do you want to go to start planting, you can use the same type of insights at the end of the season to figure out which field you want to address when it's time to harvest. So those are some of the insights as you walk through the entire growing season, some of the stuff you look for, some of the different types of imagery that you use to identify it, and the importance of trying to collect as much data as possible along the way to be able to sort your entire operation, to make those insights and have a better understanding of what's going on throughout the entire season. So I think there's some definite possibility there for, regardless of what point during the season that you're looking to collect imagery, there is something you can find. So that's just something important to keep in mind, is depending on what you're looking for, that's going to kind of guide what you need to deliver that imagery. And so that's something just to keep in mind. But I always say that imagery is the gift that keeps on giving. So once you've collected that imagery, even after the season is over, we still have some power to incorporate that data into our operation to make some long-term decisions. And so I'm going to hand it back over to Greg, who's going to talk a little bit about what we've done this past off-season to be able to continue to provide value to farmers even after the growing season has concluded.
Thanks so much, Ivan. So certainly decisions during the season are important, but decisions that are made after the season are also extremely, if not more important. And so just getting better insight into yield, can be a very valuable output of this type of analysis. So, for example, one of the things you can do as a farmer is categorize your fields based on when during the season they experienced a hit to yield. And so in this case, for example, we were able to bucket some set of fields that were impacted in May, a different set of fields impacted in June, and then another set of fields that were actually okay really up through July, and then had some issues due to some changing weather, drought, less rain situation in that late July, early August timeframe. So really bringing the dimension of time into analysis is very important. Really, any sort of decisions you're making in terms of nutrients, different seed selections, different starters or chemical treatments. You know, the ability to understand those in great clarity is something that this can help with. And I'll just speak for another moment on that. So this is just an example field. And several of you on the call may use an agronomy software like Ag Studio or SMS or some similar product to manage your field information. And this is just an example where by turning those images into data, you can bring that data into a system like that. I mean, this is an example of Ag Studio. And so you can see a yield map here. You can see the polygons that are on top are different types of alerts. 15 is an anomaly, 25 is a change. And you're basically able to use this data to correlate against yield and other things. So for example, this is for soil type. And then this is for different management zones that this particular farmer is using. And so, you know, really the ability to validate whether it's a management zone decision, a nitrogen management decision, any sort of decisions that you're making in terms of whether they worked or didn't work, and then really localize it, understand the cause and effect is what we're driving for here. So, so just to kind of do a quick wrap up, you know, this idea of measuring in-season crop performance is a critical to making better decisions, better understanding what's going on in the fields. It's getting easier and easier. Spatial resolution is improving. You're seeing higher and higher resolution images, you know, from satellite down to 50 centimeter, you know, 10 centimeters. Some drones are even able to get sub 2 centimeter. Spectral resolution, the different bands we discussed. Temporal resolution, especially with satellite, more and more satellites, you know, up in the sky, the ability to even get daily satellite images. Of course, the challenge with all of this is just more and more data, right? And so, you know, the ability to have something that acts as an intermediary to rank and sort is very important. And then ultimately, it's about the decisions that are made, right? It's about the actions. That's what you need to do to save time and money. So just getting more imagery or getting more this or getting more that, ultimately, it's what you do to use it that's going to make a difference to improve your operation. So, so with that, you know, just want to thank everybody for the opportunity. And Dan, I don't know if we have some questions. We're happy
we have
to
some
discuss
questions.
those.
I don't know, we have more than we're going to answer in 6 minutes. So I'm gonna forward them to you, and I'm going to let you maybe answer them, and then we'll just post them with the recap of the webinar that we put on the outside advisor. I do have a couple. I'll go through a few of these here. That the last question that came in, it kind of relates to your services and pricing schedule. Where do they find this information for Illinois?
So with respect to IntelinAir, if you go to IntelinAir.com or agmri.com, you know, which actually the website is there on this slide, you can find out information about our solution. And certainly you're also welcome to email either Ivan or I, and we're happy to answer those questions.
Okay, thank you. What imagery can be used to analyze the amount of cover crops being grown on a statewide scale in Illinois? And in that regard, I also was wondering about no-till versus tilled. What imagery can be used to kind of assess that?
So, well, with respect to, for example, cover crops across the state of Illinois, I think that's something where satellite imagery starts to come into play. I mean, anytime you're looking at collecting imagery over, very large areas like that, typically you have to use, the most scalable solution, which would be satellite. Whether it would be sufficient, frankly, to answer the specific questions that we're talking about with respect to cover crop, obviously the devil's in the details. We would have to get into that. With respect to tillage, I think that's actually a very interesting area where you're seeing a lot of research, well, maybe not a lot, but definitely research today in terms of taking imagery post-till, analyzing the quality of the tillage operation, and then correlating that to the crop performance during the following season. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity here to be able to take compare different tillage practices, really compare any sort of different agronomic practice that you're looking to employ or considering for the farm.
We'll probably discuss this. All right, here's another question. What is your opinion on false NDVI maps created from standard camera versus true NDVI camera?
Yeah, we had one of the bullets talked about this a little bit and didn't really speak to it, but the quality of camera is important, and if you're looking at doing analysis where you, really want to make decisions and be disciplined about it, you really need a good camera. And, certainly there's, good cameras out there available for drones. And, in the plains, of course, you're able to, use very high-end cameras just because you can, have the larger carrying capacity. But the camera is extremely important. I mean, using like a standard DJI Phantom camera, which is great, by the way, for what it does. It's great for visual crop scouting, but expecting to modify that and get good results, I think is it's not going to be as likely. One
of your graphics mentioned being able to evaluate the effectiveness of tile lines. How useful are these images at identifying unknown tile systems?
Very, very useful, for sure. We actually, so I was in a meeting last year with a farmer who was very surprised to see a tile line in his field that he wasn't even aware that it existed. So definitely, I mean, getting insight into drainage in a field, soil moisture, water flow, that is, a big advantage with this. And I think you're going to see that in terms of future features becomes more and more visible via algorithms and so forth to the farmer over the coming years.
And I'll just add, Greg, you're absolutely correct with that. And it also, I think, stands to show the power of that multispectral analysis and, looking at a field from a number of different lenses, even beyond just tile line. One of the things that has also been a surprise to a lot of farmers is discovering previously unknown pipelines by using that thermal imagery. And so a lot of the signs where farmers know that there's a pipeline somewhere nearby, but they might not know exactly where it is. And we're very surprised to find out that it actually, does cut through their field when they thought maybe it only, clipped the corner or ran parallel. So that's also something that we've seen a major impact, and we have a better understanding by starting to compare not just NDVI imagery, but also taking a look into that RGB imagery, taking a look into that thermal imagery. And looking at the field from a few different insights, and also, as Greg said, yes, as we start to look for patterns with the anomalies.
How soon? I'm going to have two more questions, then we're going to stop. How soon and how late should images be collected?
So we start at plant, and then we plan roughly weekly to 10-day imagery through the early growing season, pretty much through the tassel. And then we usually do, let's say, roughly 3 images post-pollination.
Okay.
You know, if you're going to focus on high resolution, you want to focus on the early season.
Mm-hmm. And that's something too to keep in mind, is it's not just, you know, like I kind of went over, there's value to be had in images throughout the season and even slightly before, from a planning perspective. So I would say it's not necessarily when during the season you should fly. It's almost the frequency at those different times of the season. And so Greg's absolutely right. Early on in the season, I'd say there's value to flying at any point during the season, but early on is when I would have that higher frequency. And then after we reach, you know, maybe late June, I think you could probably back off a little bit on the frequency and still get the value from periodic imagery.
Can you do stand counts on soybeans?
So today, what we do is we interpolate counts. You know, with the plane, our solution this year will be at 10 centimeter per pixel resolution. So, you know, obviously it depends how early you're flying, but for those early stages, what we're doing is we're interpolating the count based on what we're measuring with our algorithms. And in the example vegetation row health image that Ivan went over, that's the image that allows us to do that. And, you know, we're happy to go into that in a lot more detail on a one-on-one call.
One last question. Is corn easier to image and interpret than soybeans because of its stature, size, less plants? Is it easier to interpret, to image and interpret?
I guess it's an interesting question. I mean, I think both crops, you know, frankly, have their challenges and have their significant use cases. So I'm not sure if one's easier than the other. I will say that, you know, soybean, especially as the season goes on, it tends to almost form a carpet. You know, whereas corn, you know, assuming it's planted in normal row widths, you know, you're typically still going to see those rows. But I'm not sure if one's easier than the other. But Ivan, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you that there's value to be had from imaging both corn and soybeans. You know, if I had to give some insight onto which, I wouldn't say necessarily one is easier than the other. What I would say is early on in the season, our insights probably tend to be shifted more towards corn, just because the rows are a little bit more distinctive. And so when we're looking at that value of high resolution, looking at the row by row analytics, those early emergence images, I think are a lot easier to pick up when we're looking at corn. But later on in the season, as the soybeans start to fill in, you do have less soil disturbance, and so it is a lot easier to catch large scale issues like nutrient deficiencies, potential pest damage. So I'd say that there is that understanding that you're going to be looking at different types of issues with both, and so it is a little bit of a different ball game. But having the understanding of what's going out in the field, I think there's absolutely similar value to be had in both corn and soybean, and then really any other row crop.
Well, I was working on a drone project 2 summers ago on a field over east of Champaign, about 30 miles. We were flying it every 2 weeks with the drone, and you're right about this carpet thing. It looked just like a carpet. You couldn't even seem to pick anything up. It was such a perfect field. But you're right, it's like a carpet out there. Okay, we're just a little bit over here. I want to thank Greg and Ivan for giving that webinar today. Thank you very much for the time you put in the presentation. Very interesting to give us a good overview and an update on the possibilities of using imagery in agriculture. I want to thank everyone on behalf of the Illinois Soybean Association and IntelinAir. Thank you very much for participating in today's webinar. And if you're a CCA, and you registered and you put in your CCA number, you'll get 1 credit in crop management. And if you listen to this webinar, that's as a recording. It will be posted within a few days on the ILSO Advisor. You can go back, listen to it. If you are listening to it and you want to get 1 credit, 1 CEU, you have to go into your account and apply for that. Again, thank you, Greg and Ivan, for your time today. And thank you, everyone, for listening. And this webinar is now over.
Thanks so